which one of us is Aluf Benn and which one of us is Jonathan Freedland. So I'm Jonathan Freedland from The Guardian. It's an absolutely huge pleasure for me to be here for this conversation, which I'm going to kick off with Aluf Benn in a moment, for two reasons. One of them we're going to talk about a lot, which is David Landau. But the first one is really about Haaretz itself. I noticed there are quite a few distinguished British journalists here who I recognise. Haaretz's place is enormously valued by many British journalists and diplomats and politicians who follow what goes on in Israel and the Middle East. The Guardian feels a very particular relationship. We often refer to Haaretz as our sister newspaper in the Middle East. We have much in common. We're both liberal, enlightened, and constantly bring delight to our Jewish readers. Have extraordinarily good relations with the government of Israel. So we do feel a kind of kindred bond between us. But as I say, it is the paper that anybody with any kind of interest in the Middle East turns to. And so I'm really delighted to be associated with it for this meeting here in London and for this conference. We're going to, Aluf and I are going to talk about David Landau. Why don't you start, Aluf, with something that, you know, we've all got so many personal memories, but why don't you begin?
Well, David was a great editor, but he was first and foremost a diplomatic correspondent throughout his life. And since I had the title when he was the editor, we did a lot of reporting together. And one of the most memorable events like that was the last trip I did with David to London in 2007 with Prime Minister Olmert, in which David showed me around Whitehall, and not only showed me the horse guards and so on, but also took me into 10 Downing Street. His cousin was working there at the time, so she got us some briefing with some British officials, and they showed us into the cabinet room and so on. And I remember David telling me how, as a kid in London, he took the tube to Westminster to watch the late former Prime Minister Winston Churchill taking the stand in Parliament. And you know, he was a great admirer of everything British, and I think his greatest disappointment till his last day was his inability to convince the British royal family to send even one of its members to an official visit to Israel, to a royal visit, as you call it. And if this ever happens, it should be named the royal visit, the David Landau royal visit by whoever to Israel.
No, I knew it was really important to him, that. And in the same spirit, the closest perhaps was the fact that we should remember this, that he was honoured. He became a member of the Order of the British Empire for his services to the relationship between the two countries. And he was hugely proud of that honour, wasn't he?
Yes, it was kind of a lifetime achievement to him, because he really bridged the two cultures in a way with his very heavy accent in Hebrew. You could never forget where he came from.
A few years ago. He invited me to sit in the Haaretz editorial conference where he was chairing as the editor-in-chief, and it was quite something to see the boss of this huge institution of Israel conducting the meeting in what can only be described as a Hendon accent, and but he was completely on top of it, but unashamedly still British. He wasn't one of those people who tried to sort of pretend he was something else. I was just going to say something about him. I mean, I don't mind admitting there are very few men outside my own family who I would say I loved, but David Landau would definitely be one of them. Hugely sort of mentor figure, and I know that, again, there are other journalists in the room here who will say the same about him. He was one of those people who you would turn to as a kind of moral guide. Where was David on this issue? And it would guide yourself. And on one of them, I remember he and I took a different position on Operation Cast Lead, which I think he supported and I was against. But in 2014, in the conflict over Gaza then, he absolutely influenced my thinking with this piece, which I think just says a lot about him. And I'll just mention what he said there. People talk a lot about, and the publisher, Amos Shokan, has talked about this, about being on the left and yet a figure steeped in Orthodox tradition. At the time, a lot of people were saying that you could not possibly accuse Israel of anything like the conduct of Hamas because of the intention was totally different, that Hamas intended to kill civilians and Israel didn't. And David Landau wrote a piece going into halakha, saying that, what does halakha say about intention? And he told this story of a rabbi walking with his son, and the son says, it's a sort of weird thing, but apparently it's there in the Jewish sources. The son says, "Daddy, I want a chicken's head as a plaything." And so the rabbi goes and removes the head of the chicken, but he's not guilty, says this rabbi, of killing the chicken because all he wanted was the head. It was collateral damage that the chicken died. It was a side effect. That wasn't the intention. And David Landau wrote that the rabbinic tradition has no patience for that. If you know that the consequence of your action will be death, it's as if you intended it. So to remove the chicken's head is the same as deciding to kill the chicken. The same, he said, would be true of Israel bombing an area knowing civilians would be killed. It doesn't matter if it didn't intend it. You know it will happen. And therefore, David Landau concluded, for halachic reasons, it was more moral to send in ground troops than to fight from the air, because there you had more control over the impact of your actions. There is nobody in the world besides David Landau who would have written that piece, because it came to this. He was coming from the left, but entirely rooted in Jewish tradition and halakha, and it completely altered my thinking on the conflict, but only he could have written it.
Yeah, one of his lasting legacies on the Hebrew side of Haaretz is Parashat HaShavua, which is still there, which he began.
And Haaretz didn't have that before?
No.
The Guardian doesn't have that yet either.
Well,
that's an innovation I'll be taking back to my
colleagues. Here's a challenge to you.
We'll do that. We'll find a very digital way of doing that, I'm sure. Well, look, David, I'm sure, would be now at this point telling both of us, get on with it. There's enough about me. We should talk about the subject. This is much more important. And our subject is the age of Netanyahu. And really, Aluf, me and the audience are going to want to hear you on this more than anyone. You have written very recently a piece which is very unusual and very stylishly put off, in which you write as if you are Netanyahu himself, explaining yourself. It's done in the form really of a sort of speech or a letter from Netanyahu in his voice. It's very arresting, but I mean, to the extent you can, in just the time available to us. But what is, you have Netanyahu there saying that his strategy is essentially to defeat, not just to come to a managed resolution with the Palestinian movement, to defeat them. Can you just unpack that for us?
Well, if you go through Netanyahu's writings and speeches, all the way from his books back in the 90s to his most recent Facebook statuses condemning the Israeli media and so on, there is a very strong line that you can follow. And that is, he never used that term, defeating the Palestinians. But when you look at his sources of inspiration, like Ronald Reagan, who came to power vowing to defeat the Soviet Union, to win the Cold War, not just to manage it, while the rest of the American establishment was all about balance of power and detente. When Netanyahu equates time and again the Palestinian national movement to the Nazis, most recently in his bizarre argument that the Mufti, the founder or the founding leader of the Palestinian national movement, was the one actually convincing Hitler to murder the Jews in the Holocaust, which all historians refuted instantly. But apparently he believes in the analogy. And obviously what he meant was not to change historical research, but to say that Abu Mazen's speeches today and policy today is that legacy. And you can't compromise with the Nazis. If your enemy is the Nazis, you can't compromise. At the same time, there's the common criticism of Netanyahu in Israel by both his supporters and the opposition is that all he cares about is survival, is job security. Now, again, knowing Netanyahu and where he comes from, the son of an historian, who's not so much of an intellectual himself like his father was, I don't know how many people know that, but Netanyahu is an architect by training, and from MIT. And I believe that the literary figure that he was following was Howard Roark, the main character, the protagonist of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. Why? Because if you look at how Netanyahu plays it, it's the same. I'm right, all the powers that be are wrong, and you're always looking to fight those stronger powers. Be it President Clinton in his first term, President Obama in this term. There's a big antagonist in Netanyahu's story. That is the publisher of Yediot Achronot, which he accused during the campaign as being his arch enemy, which again is and the model character is the publisher in the fountainhead. So we have Netanyahu, but despite being an architect, he loves history. And I can't imagine Netanyahu thinking of himself of a future biography or future historian writing about his term in office and summarizing it. Well, he managed the conflict for a decade plus, and that was it.
I mean, it is meaningful to speak about the age of Netanyahu because he has been prime minister for 10 of the last 20 years.
Not only that, he's the second longest serving Israeli prime minister after the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. And if he concludes his term, as is more likely given the changes in his coalition, he will be the longest serving Israeli prime minister, which was unthinkable when he was voted out of office in 1999. To most people at the time, he appeared to be, to most pundits, he appeared to be a fluke, some aberration of Israeli history. And you know, when the old establishment coming back to power with Barak and then Sharon from both sides of the aisle.
But the point you made before about people thinking in a way he just wants his legacy to be an amount of time in office, that he wants to break Ben-Gurion's record. But in that piece, let's just go through that one, just conclude that point. In the piece you wrote, you suggested that he has a real strategic goal. It is total victory, and your point about the Nazis is well taken. But he has, you also mentioned it, compared it to the Cold War. The idea, just tell us how he thinks he can win.
Well, all his demands from the Palestinians are always on the narrative side, are always about change the PLO National Covenant, recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish people, forgo the claim of right of return, and so on. And he always puts that first and foremost. But these are the pillars of the Palestinian national movement, rejection of Zionism. Well, you know, he believes that he can outlast, the Jewish people exist for thousands of years. The Palestinian people, if we quote some of Netanyahu's people in Netanyahu's inner circle, are imaginary people that appeared on the global stage several decades ago. And in his mind, the main obstacle for Israeli victory is not the power of the Arab conventional armies that mostly disappeared in the last 5 years, or even terrorist attacks. It is you people in the West, and the way that Western public opinion recognized and agrees with the Palestinian national demands.
And how does he propose